Hello, folks. Welcome to United in Liberty Radio. Dustin Harris and Joe Olivas hanging out with you once again as we come back, talk about true principles of freedom, specifically the 12 principles of liberty as espoused by United in Liberty. And we talk about truth here. We talk about things that really matter. We get through the fluff that everybody else is talking about and talk about things as they relate to our lives. Talk about things as they are, as they were, and as they are to come. Hi, Joe.
How you doing?
I'm good. I'm always excited to get on the air and talk about some important things that are going on out there in the world. We've got the BP oil spill continuing, and everybody pointing fingers at everybody else, not letting BP just do their job, but that's another story for last week. We've got other things, of course, going on in the news as well, and I know you've run across some things this week as well that we'd like to get into a little bit today also.
Well, it's important that we recognize and understand the importance of adopting our own individual code, if you will, our principles that we choose to live our lives by. I mean, it's important when we do that and we measure everything that we do by these principles that we espouse. It makes it for a much easier type of life. We can identify things that would violate our rights quite easily once we understand and recognize the core set of principles. I mean, we hear a lot of things that are going on. You mentioned BP, but there's a lot of things that are going on in the news and what's going on in our government. And people still feel that something's wrong. They know that things aren't right. Some people can articulate that, and other people still cannot at this point. And we hope to be able to educate individuals on principles so that they can then be able to recognize when principles and rights are being violated.
Well, and that's the key. You've got to know what your core set of principles are, and you've got to know, first of all, what a principle is. A principle is a truth. A truth does not change over time. A truth was as true in Adam and Eve's day as it will be at the end of the world. They last throughout the centuries. It does not matter the political climate that you find yourself in. It doesn't matter what they're saying on Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, any of those. It doesn't matter what they're saying in your own church. A truth always exists. It always has existed. It always will exist. But you've got to find what principles exist in your life, what truths you are going to live your life by. And then, as I read in a book recently, you do what is right and damn the torpedoes. It doesn't matter what comes your way. If you're doing what's right, eventually you're going to be on the right side of the fence.
Well, yeah, that's a great point, Dustin. I mean, the thing that people need to understand is there are principles and there are ideas. You mentioned that a principle is a truth, and I think that's the great identifier, that it's because it's a truth, because it's something that can hold true in any aspect, meaning you have a principle that you want to adhere to. If that doesn't translate across the board in every other area, if you can't take that particular principle or idea at this point and translate that across every other aspect of your life, it's not a truth, it's not a principle. Only when it translates across the board can it be counted as a principle. Everything else is just an idea. So you hear individuals that say that they believe or adhere to a certain type of principle, but it only applies to their financial life. It doesn't apply to their spiritual life. It doesn't apply to their emotional life or their life with their wives and their children.
And I hear what you're saying. In other words, it has to apply across the board in different aspects. It also has to apply over the test of time. For example, the Declaration of Independence, I sometimes refer to that sacred document as the Declaration of Principles. You find true principles in that document. Jefferson didn't make them up. He may have penned that document, but he got them from on high. He got them from the Bible. He got them from John Locke. He got them from eternal sources because they are eternal principles. The Constitution of the United States, though may not articulate principles, it enshrines principles. In other words, it vouchsafes those principles that were put forth by Jefferson in 1776. We move forward a few years, 1787. They've won the war. It's now time to enshrine those principles and protect them so that they can't be taken from us down the road. over the test of time, those principles won't change. You pointed out something to me this week I thought was quite interesting. Got a text from Joe this week saying, "Have you seen the story about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the little epilogue or footnote that a particular publisher has put in that book?" To paraphrase, what this particular publisher had put in the book was simply, these principles, these things that are taught in these specific documents were great at one point, but life has changed. To make sure your kids understand that we adhere to a different set of not principles, but different set of rules. A different set or a different aspect of life than we did back then. We now look at race different and gender different and sexual preference different. And so, these things don't apply like they used to. Well, you know what, Joe? If it's a principle, it's a principle, and it doesn't matter whether you're in 1776, 1787, or 2010.
Well, the part about that disclaimer notice that publisher put on the Declaration and Constitution, the last part of it when it's talking about, or again to paraphrase, but when you're talking to your children about this classical work, that's not a classical work. To me, a classical work is something where that doesn't endure. It's just something that I look at the Constitution as something that will. It's just as valid for me today as it will be for my children, as it will be for my grandchildren. Because it protects my rights today, it is current. It's a current work. When it protects my children's rights, it's a current work for them. It's not a classical work that some author wrote many, many years ago.
A book of fiction.
Let's just take it for what it was back then, not for what it should be now. That's just That's just silly to me.
Well, and those are the kind of things, though, that we're dealing with, Joe, as we deal with current events, as we turn on the news, as we turn on the internet and the radio and the newspaper and what have you, and we watch what's going on throughout this country. It really comes back to why United in Liberty was formed in the first place, because what we have done is moved away from those core principles. The only way that we're going to change Washington is by changing the principles. The only way that you change the principles, and when I say change the principles, I don't mean change the actual principles. I mean you change people's you educate people. You help them to reestablish what the true principles are. Educate them on those principles that have always existed, that no, we're not going to change. We're just going to remind you as to what those principles are. Because when you do that at a local level, that filters up. It changes Washington because it's changed from the grassroots level.
Well, and those principles, specifically the 12 Principles of Liberty, I look at those. Those are a yardstick for me to measure my own individual actions. I look at them as a gauge to measure somebody else and how they deal with me. Meaning if an individual is willing to lie to me or be deceitful to me, I recognize that individual as one that won't adhere to principle. So I don't want to do business with that individual. I don't want to spend time with that individual. I don't want the influence of that individual in my life. Likewise, I have to be, if I'm going to be consistent and say that I'm a man that weighs everything by principle, I've got to weigh myself by principle as well. And so I've got to look at the 12 Principles of Liberty and make sure that the things that I'm doing don't violate those principles. Because if I violate those principles, I may not be directly hurting myself, but I will be directly violating the rights of another individual. And so it's important for people to recognize those types of things. And the principles that we talk about, and you mentioned the Constitution is protecting the principles that are mentioned and brought up in the Declaration of Independence, and the principles that we talk about, they help individuals be able to identify when their rights are being violated. And the way I like to look at most everything is I try and break that down to the most fundamental example so that I can explain it to my children, the youngest of my children, so they can grasp it immediately. And you'd be surprised with most children. I think they recognize it. We don't give them enough credit. But if I were to, there's only two ways that an individual's rights can be violated. There's only two.